for many countries in the world, often domestic investment, is heavily financed by domestic saving. We may think that India is still a relatively poor country, so people don't save a lot. But if you look at household saving rates in India are comparable to levels in China, which is extremely high, certainly much higher than what you see in Western economies.
Hey coconuts, welcome back to Chills with TFC. I'm your host Reggie, aka your chief financial coconut, and you see we have a beautiful new set and we have a great friend back on the show. It's been like what, 3 years?
You tell me, Reggie.
Yeah, I think it's been 3 years. So when we first had you on the show, it was Golden Mile, that was kind of where we were. Old school, and then the building tore down, and then we are now here in a much better location. You better don't say where we are. So
Fancy digs.
It's a nice place. Yeah? It's a nice place. Welcome back.
Thank you, Reggie. Thanks for the invitation.
For audience that for some reason they don't know you, would you like to introduce yourself?
Happy to introduce myself. My name is Jamus. I am an associate professor at ESSEC Business School. It's a French business school with a presence in Singapore. I also wear a second hat. I'm an elected member of parliament for Sengkang GRC.
Yeah, but today you come in a personal capacity, right? Yes.
I come in a professional capacity wearing my associate professor hat.
Yes. So today I would like to first congratulate you on the book launch.
Thank you.
Woo! Yeah, so Asian economies, and that's why we're here, right? On the Financial Coconut. When I saw your launch, I was telling my producer, hey, let's get Jamus on to talk, because I think a lot of people are kind of concerned about the world, where is it going? Maybe not with the Asian economies as the backdrop first. They will first think like, okay, US, China, they're quarreling, right? So it's getting quite problematic.
So in some ways, Asian economies are always in the backdrop somehow. If it's US, China, then China is lurking there. If there are other kinds of conflicts in the South Asian region, then India is there. So in many ways, I think you can say that Asian economies, befitting much of their position in the long span of history, are definitely becoming a lot more prominent in global affairs.
Yeah, for sure. And I think how I want to take it today will be, let's educate us a little bit, right? The professor had tell us a little bit, how should we look at some of these economies? How are they structured? How are they shaped, across the board? And then we can talk a little bit about how you think Singapore should position for this new frontier, right? Because everybody is saying it's the Asian century. And then, of course, give our audience some wisdom, we all individual, we can do some stuff. So how should we then position ourselves, right? So maybe for a start, walk us through, tell us a little bit about the book.
Sure.
How did you come to this? And, what do you want to share within it?
Well, let me start by talking a little bit about Asian economies. So Asia more generally. Asia, of course, is a huge continent and a very diverse continent. And when we are inclined to think about Asia, especially located in Singapore, we often think of Asia as, well, either China, Japan, Northeast Asia, to the extent that we're here, obviously Southeast Asia. And if you stretch folks' minds a little bit, they also think about South Asia, so India and the rest of the economies in the subcontinent. What we seldom recall is that Asia is much larger than that. For much of global history, Central Asia was a traversing point. Mongolia, for instance, was the home of Genghis Khan, and that little part of the world went on to conquer much of the known world at the time. Let's focus on the three largest economies in Asia. So that will be China, Japan, and India. I'll put two lenses on them. And the first lens is something that I've already alluded to, which is their levels of development. So in some ways, you can think of these three economies almost like snapshots in time. They are at different stages of development. India is in some ways still the furthest behind, and then that's followed by China. And what you then have much more advanced into the future in some ways, an unfolding future for the other two economies is Japan. That level of development from still very much developing lower middle income to upper middle income for China, almost approaching high income status. Certainly, that's the goal of the Xi administration, to reach a high income status by 2030. And then finally, Japan, which was also the first Asian economy to industrialize, but today is clearly firmly entrenched among advanced economies. So that's one lens to look at them, their levels of development. And one way to think about that is just how they have progressed over time. I guess if you want to relate it back to something you're familiar with Singapore. So India would be maybe Singapore in the 30s or 40s. And then China would be Singapore in the 1970s and 80s. And of course, Japan is, well, in some ways, Singapore in terms of per capita income has exceeded Japan, but Japan would be something like Singapore today or maybe Singapore in the 2010s. So that's one way to think about the three economies. The other useful lens, I think, for many people is demography. So the oldest of the three in terms of the population, of course, is Japan. Life expectancy is very high in Japan. They eat well, and high income countries tend to be able to afford high quality healthcare and maintain high quality diets and so on. And so they definitely are the most aged society as it unfolds. And then China, of course, is dynamic but rapidly aging society. In many ways, China is writ large rather than writ small, what the four so-called Asian dragons, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong, it is playing out that demographic future in a slightly faster rate of speed, but generally that's what's happening. And then India still has a young, dynamic, growing population. So they are still on the rising part of their demographic curve. They will eventually get there in the 2030s, 2040s. They will start to have a greater number of elderly that would influence their ability to sustain the elderly population. In fact, if you look now, even at fertility, India has fallen substantially as well. Fertility is in the twos, especially in the major cities. If you look at a country like China, of course, China has a fertility rate something in the order of 1.4, 1.5. Part of that history of that one-child policy. They're trying to reverse that a little bit, and it is offset a little bit by the inland. It is in the mid ones. In fact, 1.5 maybe on the high side.
So is it our stop at 2 that's causing like the fertility?
Well, perhaps.
crisis?
You see, the thing is that once you pass this point, it's sometimes known as the demographic transition. Inevitably, it's a combination of factors: national policy, an educated population, especially among women who can make more of the decision on whether they want to continue to have more children, a family decision about focusing more on quality rather than quantity. That's when you see Japan as well. So Japan has a fertility rate 1.2, 1.3, still unfortunately higher. Well, unfortunately for those of us like in Singapore that have a fertility rate that's below 1, but they were certainly one of the economies that were among the first in the world to get there with low rates of fertility and high shares of the elderly population. And in many ways, you can almost get a peek into the future of how countries like Singapore, which grew very rapidly but now are rapidly aging as well.
And probably the cities are already much lower, right? And because the countries are huge, so the countryside will kind of replace more, than the people in the city.
Yeah, so
Right?
certainly in the developing country, the countryside would tend to have higher birth rates and a lower average age. But what often happens though, because the opportunities are in the cities, so you see a lot of migration of the young once they are economically able to work and so on, they would go to the cities. And in fact, in China, it's not unusual for you to have dual income couples working in the cities. They will have children, but for a long time, China maintained this migration policy. It's almost like an internal passport system known as the Hukou. And that would restrict your ability to obtain certain kinds of social welfare services, education, healthcare, and so on. And so a lot of them would send their kids back to grow up in the village with grandparents. We do that too. We get grandparents to take care of our kids while the parents work. But of course, ours is like from one town to another, right? Within Singapore, for them, it is a 6-hour train ride, and that's why Chinese New Year is a big deal for them, because that's when the family really tuan yuan, they really get back together, usually in the hometown.
Yeah, it's very boring one, the Chinese New Year. Right? Because they come from all over, then they get home, then they just stay home, right? Because that's all they want. I tried visiting them.
And it's
I
what,
thought
2
it was fun.
weeks?
Yeah,
So,
yeah. It's very boring. They will do the same thing with the same bunch of people, and then they go to different. Okay, boring to us as a visitor, but for them it's like family time, right? For us, like we go like 4 or 5 households in a day, right? It's very
But
different.
it's huge, right? If you
Yeah.
think about it, it's for some of these parents, it would be maybe just once that year, or if they're lucky, twice that year that they're seeing their kids for a period of a week or two, and then they're back in the cities, living by themselves, working so that they can remit the money back to
Yeah,
the villages.
yeah.
So it's really admirable in some ways. One has to make a
So,
living.
so since we're on China, right? How about expand for us a little bit, right? What is your read on the Chinese economy? What's going on there? Because this Hukou thing is also creating some problems with the city people trying to go back to the rural towns or like the suburbs to, there's always a natural kind of migration flow where things are not so well in the city. People will retreat out of the city, and you see that in the US, you see that in like Europe. Like, bigger countries all have that. Singapore, no place, because you go Johor, right? That's about it, right? Yeah.
Oh, and you're not a citizen of Johor,
Yeah,
so
yeah, and you're
you
not, right? It's very common, you see migration happen that way, right? And China is also seeing that, but I hear that the Hukou thing is creating some problems, but that and more, right? Kind of share with us what is your read on the Chinese economy? What do you think will happen going forward and all that stuff?
China's economy and its overall policy making apparatus. What's interesting about them is that they had several big moves that many would regard as blunders. Policies like the Hukou and the one child policy. These policies really shaped the China that we see today. Interestingly, over the past decade and a half, China has tried to backtrack on a lot of these policies. So one child is now first went to two child, and then now there's more like three if you can
The
have it. Yeah,
better.
yeah. So they have backtracked on that. Even with the Hukou, they have adjusted it dramatically. In some of the attractive second tier cities, it's really liberalizing there as well as they try to get people to be willing to move there. And interestingly, there's been a more recent development where some of the Rust Belt cities, if you will, those in the northeast of China, what used to be Manchuria, they also have been trying to liberalize it as an effort to attract people back into those Rust Belt cities. So in some ways, there is a really dynamic movement in terms of policy to try to address some of these, if you will, policy blunders. But my concern going forward is just how quickly policymakers are responding to these. In the high growth years in China, so in the 90s and the 2000s. But nevertheless, when you have one person that is mostly endowed with the ability to make decisions and the authority to make decisions, the risk of becoming ossified and the risk of people with alternative ideas, with views that are not part of the status quo, it becomes harder for these individuals and sometimes risky for these individuals to voice out.
So would you say this is like a huge structural risk for the Chinese economy going forward?
Huge. And I think we saw it play out in COVID. I think most people, most observers of China in the earlier stages of COVID would have thought that it wasn't poorly managed in the beginning. They were a disciplined policy making apparatus. They managed to shut the borders. They managed to prevent the spread of the disease. And that was necessary at the beginning. Unfortunately, they were slow in doing was to recognize that COVID ultimately would mutate fast enough that it was impossible to completely shut that out from the population. And so it became necessary to live with COVID as we have chosen to do here, as almost every economy in the world now has chosen to do. But China was very slow in coming to that conclusion. And for a long time, they were still betting on their domestic vaccines rather than the more modern mRNA vaccines. And I think slowness really lost them a tremendous amount of time. It stripped the economy of a lot of momentum that they had prior to going in. Of course, we'll never know the genuine counterfactual, but if the economy had been willing to, like many other Asian economies, quickly pivot into living with COVID earlier on, a year earlier, half a year earlier, it would have made a material difference to their prospects today. The economy was just allowed to decelerate so much in the time that they chose with that to have the zero COVID policy, that by the time they decided to reopen, it became really, really hard to fire up the engines again.
Yeah, yeah. So I think I just went to one of the big banks, conferences. They always have these things, right? And I think they were predicting like 5 to 6% growth, and it's like even a question mark whether China can grow at that continued rate. But of course, it is at a different size, But I think everybody's just trying to suss it out, like what's going on here and all that.
One thing to keep in mind about larger economies and developing economies is that a high headline growth number doesn't translate into the same thing that we think about when we think about the growth of advanced economies like the United States or Europe or even more recently Singapore, in many of these developing countries, they're at a stage of their development where, for various reasons, less so in China, but certainly in India, if you grew at 4%, you are just keeping pace with population growth. So you're not getting any richer at all. So in per capita terms, a 4% headline growth rate doesn't make you any more prosperous. In China, it's a little different. As I explained, China is already on the other side of that demographic curve. So of course, a 5% growth rate does increase their per capita incomes, but certainly slower than you would in an economy where, like Japan, where in fact, if anything, the population is shrinking. So even though many people look at Japan's headline growth rate and say, wow, this is terrible. This is only 1%, 1.5%. We're able to eke out 2% in recent times. They think, wow, that's terrible. But when your denominator is also shrinking, then that becomes a lot more impressive. And so the Japanese are indeed still continuing to be relatively more prosperous over time, even with a low headline growth rate.
I want to go to Japan, but one last question about China. Okay, so I think the demographic thing is one thing, right? And the COVID thing is another thing. But there's also this discussion in the private economy that a lot of people are kind of afraid to do more things and take risks after that few, like 3 red lines on the property sector, the tuition market, like some of these bigger moves, even the gaming market all these are very big policies. You could argue it's quite blunt, right? And it's just like a blanket ban in some ways. Multiple of these policies came very close back to back each other a few years ago. Economists will say, I told you what other economists say, right? Like, so it affects, business confidence, no entrepreneurs want to invest anymore, blah, blah, blah. Do you think that that's structural? Do you think that it's going to leave some things, on the table? What's going to happen?
I wouldn't use the word structural quite yet, simply because it actually is a policy choice. So it's an outcome of policy decisions by the Xi administration. I absolutely agree that these are huge risk factors. So we put our finger on this earlier on about how in China's most dynamic years in the 90s and the 2000s, when they were growing very, very rapidly, it was really driven from the ground up. Individuals were allowed, in fact, even earlier than that, basically after the death of Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping took over, and he said, to get rich is a good thing. And that launched a process where there was a lot of devolution. Of course, that devolution came with some costs. Tiananmen was one example of when they felt that they devolved a little bit too much and too quickly, and so that's when they pulled back. They pulled back a lot of the levers, especially of the macroeconomy. So fiscal policy went back to the center, monetary policy through the People's Bank of China went back and got a lot more centralized. But nevertheless, a lot of the rest of the economy was allowed to run. And more recently, we saw that was part of what allowed the digital economy in China to pick up. And in fact, I would say even till today, it remains the most sophisticated digital economy in the world, certainly for any large economy, because people were allowed, the Jack Ma's of the world were allowed to go ahead and apply their entrepreneurial talents to develop companies and industries beyond just the digital. There were other elements as well that were allowed to just run. Tuition is a good example. So I'm very sympathetic, right? We are.
Like Singapore has this tuition problem also,
we
right?
are an over-tutored, and in some ways, it is also a little bit of a race to the bottom, because if class performance is always relative, then if everyone gets tutored up, then in the end, you will still end up with what you started off with. Of course, that's not to take away from the fact that, well, then you still have a more skilled or educated or trained workforce. But nevertheless, a lot of it, especially when you do class rankings in terms of relative terms, then you just end up at more or less the same place as with less tuition. So it's one of those things where I feel I can sympathize with why there was a policy decision to pull back. But it's when you start to come up with good justifications for putting your finger into this part of the pie, into that part of the pie, into yet another part. And that's when all these tweaks start to, you have to get them all right. And if you start to, for whatever reason, make errors just as like we mentioned earlier on with COVID and so on. When these errors work its way into the economy and they get compounded, that's when you really sap the economy of the kind of dynamism that, to be fair, economists or even business people don't fully understand. Sometimes economists call them animal spirits, in part because that's a way of expressing just this sense of business confidence and consumer confidence, but it's crucial. We are, after all, humans. The way that we organize society is the economy is embedded within the rubrics of society, and so the way that humans think and make decisions on investment and consumption is very much also driven by this sense of sentiment. And so we discount it at our peril. And I think when we start to try to pull too many levers as if we were genuine engineers of the system, that's when we risk derailing the train altogether.
Hey, welcome to the Financial Coconut Podcast Network. I'm your host, Reggie, aka your Chief Financial Coconut. And if you're loving what we're creating here, like, share, subscribe, share with your loved ones, comment in the comment section below. And yeah, we'll see you for great content on Chills with TFC. Okay, fair. So yeah, then Japan. Japan is a long-standing discussion, right? In economy, in the finance markets, even with the business people, like Japan, what's there in Japan, right? And deflation, demographic problems, all that jazz. But it's still around. It didn't really catch some of the big innovation cycle in the past, decade. No smartphone, big brands came from Japan. No real EVs are from Japan, So there are some of these things that kind of failed to caught on. I think they just retired a floppy disk not too long ago. Don't attack me, okay? But just want to hear your view, because you sounded quite like Japan is still relevant, still cool.
I do think it's relevant. And I think many people like to think of Japan as yesterday's economy. There are some elements, as I mentioned earlier on, it struggles with this aging society, this demographic challenge. But Japan still has quite a lot to contribute. So some people don't realize this, but at least till maybe about 5-8 years ago, Japan was still one of the most innovative countries when you look at quantitative metrics of innovation, things like patents that are registered. So they may be in more esoteric areas, maybe not the areas that you typically associate with web technologies and so on, but there were innovations that was coming out of Japan, very practical innovations. Korea has really caught up, certainly in per capita terms, but Japan, because it's a larger population and a large number of scientists and engineers in the workforce, they were coming up with a lot of these innovations as well. Japan is also a rich economy, and by dint of that, they still are among the major outward investors in much of Asia. Certainly, when it was the first country in the region to industrialize, it was investing initially in the four dragon economies, Korea and Singapore and so on. And in fact, this was a model. The Japanese call it the flying geese model. And that was Japan's vision, that it would invest in the countries in the region. Those countries will eventually rise, as they did, the example economies that I mentioned on Korea and so on. And then those economies started to invest. Singapore is now a major outward investor, Korea, Hong Kong. Then that brings the next wave of investors into China and the next wave, then Vietnam and so on. So in many ways, Japan is very relevant also in terms of outward investment. And so I hesitate to say that just because it is shrinking in terms of its population, and because its economy is definitely working at a slower pace, growing at a slower pace than that of China and India, it is therefore irrelevant. That's like saying that Europe's economy is irrelevant. In some ways, it is falling behind, and there's no doubt that there are structural problems within Europe as well, including demographics, but also other things. But no one would say that Europe doesn't have the capacity. They still have great universities within Europe. They still have a lot of wealth for which can be invested. Japan, just like Europe, is more than just places that we can go for holidays, to ski and to enjoy sushi. There's, even in economic terms, quite a lot still to contribute to the rest of the region.
You just shared your tourist plan. right? Sushi, ski.
Well, I'm
It's
sharing the tourist
typical.
plan that most typical
Most Singaporeans will
Singaporeans
do.
would do.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
No, yeah, just to kind of expand on that, right? I do think that it's important for working professionals, SME tauke, to kind of start to understand that economies these days are not just like what is happening locally, like on the soil, right? Like in Japan itself, like they export a lot of stuff. It's a big trade market. And then, of course, the big banks are here, right? So the capital markets are also very exciting.
Japan has huge banks.
Yeah, huge
Right?
banks.
Huge banks.
All three of them are here.
And of course, they are no longer the largest ones in Asia. The largest ones are now in China, but they're still huge. They provide a lot of financing both to Japanese firms. They're conglomerates, and the Japanese call it the keiryetsu. And it's starting to fade a little bit, that model where basically what you had at the top of the keiryetsu is a banking institution, a financial institution, as well as a trading company, as well as a manufacturing company, and they would all be whole shares with across each other, the cross shareholding structure, and then they would also have a whole supply chain that would supply within that conglomerate. So that's starting to splinter a little bit, but nevertheless, those are some of the largest and most successful conglomerates in the world. Even if we think that Japan missed a little bit of the boat when it comes to the EV revolution, they bet much more on hybrids. But the reality is that they are still one of the major car manufacturers in the world. Of course, China is now eating everyone's lunch. If you think about precision engineering equipment, various kinds of capital goods, Japan still has a role to play. Microprocessors. Of course, everyone thinks about Taiwan and TSMC, but Japan is still a relevant player
Big
in that
supplier in the
space. Yeah.
chain. Yeah, maybe we wrap up with India, right? Like talk a little bit about it. And I think Temasek is investing quite a bit. And then we had Alpin coming on the show to talk a little bit about that. Check out the episode with Temasek, huh? Yeah, so I think a lot of people are doing that, but with mixed messaging, right? So like some people say it's a crazy place, not for everyone, to do business and invest. Some people say, oh, it's a great opportunity, big population. So the story is always there, right? So like, what is your take? Where are you? How should we look at this?
Yeah, certainly with any rapidly growing emerging economy like India, the opportunities are definitely there for the taking, right? The difficulty, of course, is successfully breaking into the market and being able to entrench yourself there, especially relative to some otherwise already very successful incumbents. So, India's economy, as well as its industrial structure, is characterized by these conglomerates as well, the large business houses. And a lot of these large business houses, they tend to have a presence in many, many diverse markets. And often they are the trusted brand. We've seen companies, even very competitive companies from the rest of the world, try to break into the Indian market, Walmart, for instance, and not succeed simply because they didn't fully understand that market. And same for China. Many people who go into China think that, well, it's this huge market. And it is a huge market. With a lot of these emerging economies, you really have to understand the nuances of the market, how business is done in those countries, and how to adapt your product for the demands of the consumers in that country. That's why, at least for me, I think that one way to go to break in while hedging your risks into these markets is to do so with a local partner, right? Obviously, the risk when it comes to local partners, as anyone who has gone in to China with a local partner, is that the local partner may very quickly become a local competitor and then is no longer a partner and then very quickly forced out of the market. That definitely happens in
That's
China.
why you register in Singapore so that you litigate in Singapore, right? But even then,
but it doesn't matter, right? Even if you
you
litigate, the fact of the matter is you are shut out of that market.
Yeah.
And with technology that you brought in, to a certain degree, that's the case in India too. They arguably a lot of smart people, long civilization. With people who know how to do business, while they still are not quite there when it comes to the kind of manufacturing might that China has managed to really muster up in a very short time. We shouldn't forget that India, for a long time, had its own manufacturing industry. It was in the 19th century, for example, Indian textiles and garments were among the most productive in the world. In fact, until the Industrial Revolution, I do think that they have a history of artisanship, of craftsmanship, of being able to work with their hands that would allow them to also embrace the manufacturing revolution were it to occur there, even if it is the case that at the moment they haven't. And why I mentioned at the moment they haven't is this is a well-known feature of the Indian economy among observers, is that it has gone through a process where it really emphasized the services sector and has become world-class in some of these services sectors. But it got almost skipped over that manufacturing element. And this was the big promise, right, of Modi. When he was elected, he was the chief minister first of Gujarat, which is a relatively more industrial state. And the idea was to export that Gujarat model to the rest of India because the goal there was to make in India. And they haven't quite gotten there. They have started to try to ramp up their manufacturing capacities. They will be giving second tier manufacturing economies like Vietnam a run for their money. But until the various other institutional constraints in India, things like making sure that interstate commerce is truly smooth, reducing the amount of red tape that comes along with doing business, simplifying the overall process of doing business in India. Until that happens, manufacturing will still, I suspect, struggle, but the potential is absolutely there.
Yeah, but we all know manufacturing is a very high capex business, right? You got to invest in the roads, the ports, the water supply, energy, and then we talk about the plants, right? And there's so many things.
We often think, especially coming from Singapore, we often think, well, the source for that capital must be FDI. And certainly we relied a ton on foreign direct
I love
investments.
how that's what we usually think.
Well, it's true. But there, I think we often think about financing for capital expenditures to emanate from external sources, foreign direct investment. But in reality, that is not always the case. And in fact, one of the key features that many open economies exhibit, even open economies, is a high correlation between saving and investment. So what that means in practical terms is that for many, many countries in the world, often investment, domestic investment, is heavily financed by domestic saving. We may think that India is still a relatively poor country, so people don't save a lot. But if you look at household saving rates in India are comparable to levels in China, which is extremely high, certainly much higher than what you see in Western economies. And at least until recently, it was even higher. Where India's national saving lags when it comes to corporate saving. And corporate saving in India is usually very, very low, if not negative. So Indian corporations tend to borrow
Suck on it.
rather than rely on retained earnings. So if you were to just transpose Chinese firms' levels of retained earnings, corporate saving, into Indian firms, then you will end up with a situation where India is absolutely able to finance its potential nascent and ongoing manufacturing revolution purely from domestic sources. Of course, then once things get going, then you will have foreign investments that come in as well. But I believe it's possible. Some of the reasons why I think that Indian corporate saving is underperforming tends to be in the Indian banking system. It's still a little bit ossified, but if there's additional competition in Indian banking, more of a sense in which it's no longer as reliant on the state when it comes to financing, then really you start to see the possibility of India becoming the next big workshop of the world.
So you believe India internally have the capabilities?
They have the capability. They have very real challenges to be able to get there. I certainly believe that the potential is absolutely there. I believe the potential is even higher than some of the other nations that we sometimes think of as maybe at the vanguard of becoming the next manufacturing capital,
Like
right?
Vietnam.
Like Vietnam.
Okay. Like Indonesia.
Like Indonesia.
Okay. So you think India has a higher probability based on your analysis?
I'll put it this way. India has the capability and the potential, but whether it has a higher probability is heavily contingent on it getting its business environment right. And until it gets that business environment, I haven't quite seen it yet. Although India has done well in the past, I would say, decade, that has to really process of revamping its environment, its business climate, its institutional context, its efficiency of its government processes. Until all that gets squared away, I'm afraid we won't quite see India fulfill its potential.
But Moody has been around for a while, so it's a good sign,
Yes,
right?
well,
That things are doing well.
So for a while, people had a lot of hope. Then he disappointed a little bit. But in more recent times, things seem to have picked up again. Certainly after COVID, India has been among the best performing large economies in the world. So we'll see if countries around the world that are developing a breakthrough and emerge is good for the world as a whole. At least one to be optimistic.
Great. So any more, you got to read the book, right? We don't have more time for that, but bringing it all back to Singapore, right? Because we're in Singapore, many of our listeners are working professionals. There are like SME bosses, so even if they work in a big corp, sometimes there's strategy meeting, whether do we want to expand regionally, or there are more and more global roles here, or even like Singaporeans going out, to capture these opportunities, not just businesses, but professionals. I think that kind of is where our audience is at, right? So with that whole context being laid out about Asian economies, the Asian century, the future, not just you talking about it, many other people, how do you think we should do it? How do you think Singapore and Singaporeans should capture this thing?
The thing about Singaporeans is we are fantastic operators. We're well trained, but we tend to perform best when we work within known parameters. We need the problem to be relatively well defined. And once we have that, we are able to execute really well. You see that at all levels here in business, in school, in government. That's often our comparative strength. But also, in some ways, when you're navigating a new business environment, that's also our weakness because we might carry too many of our assumptions about how business should be done and have certain expectations of the business environment that isn't going to be present in some of these other countries. The more we become comfortable working in not always well-defined business environments where we could be disappointed, but nevertheless, you learn how to take that in your stride and then use your talents, the talents that you clearly have, that people around the world do look to us for having these skills. If you're able to apply that in a flexible context, I think that will be important. I can't stress it enough, right? I think that our educational system, while it does impart in us a great ability to reason and to problem solve, we also need a certain degree of intellectual flexibility. Some of it we gain by exposing ourselves, becoming more open to going to countries where the governance environment is just much less well defined, doing stints if you work for a corporation, being willing to go to regional offices and spending time there, learning how to navigate those idiosyncrasies that are in those regional offices. And once we gain that handle, then we become a lot more comfortable and we realize that actually we have the capability to do so. If I had to put my finger on another country where entrepreneurs tend to be much more comfortable with, that is Hong Kong. So Hong Kongers are as well trained as we are in many ways in terms of formal schooling, but they are much more comfortable navigating a less well-defined institutional and business environment. And I think we need that. As long as we make sure that our students as well as our young professionals have the opportunity and see the value of embracing this opportunity to be based, as I said, abroad for a little while, expose themselves to these other areas of the world, including especially our own backyard, Southeast Asia.
That's at the individual level, right? If we want to kind of elevate it a little bit at the national level, what do you think as a nation we could position ourselves, like strengthening the dollar, or which you talk a little bit about, to combat inflation, right? But all these are big national policies that could be a lever to kind of position ourselves in this change. How would you kind of think of in terms of like good set of interesting policies that could kind of position us as a nation to move together forward?
And so I'll talk a little bit about Enterprise SG, obviously. That is the main body. It's meant to help Singaporean firms to be willing to spread their wings and try to break into markets abroad. So if I had to compare that to other countries' kind of promotion that people think of is MITI, which is the Japanese one. During the time of the Japanese economies and Japanese corporations' heyday, MITI was really a lot more active when it came to pushing for penetration and so on. And you could argue the same would be at some level for Korea. Has a sense of a national strategy. Interestingly, not just in manufacturing, they would be able to successfully distinguish their culture from that of Japan. Because of course we had J-pop before K-pop, and many of the elements that K-pop first embraced and then subsequently built on was learned from J-pop. But then they brought it to a whole new level themselves. But also making it into an enterprise. The Japanese kind of allowed J-pop to evolve more organically, whereas the Koreans, they take in talents from a young age and then they build them up into brands. So I think there has to be a sense in which a national agency, if we truly want to make it a national endeavor. Look, Brand Singapore is well regarded. I think that we can do more in terms of trying to get Brand Singapore beyond just simply, well, of course, in areas like our human capital, our human resource. But
So you're of the position that you think to take Singapore to the next level with this like Asia growth backdrop, it's about pushing our companies to get to the next level and no longer just about like upscaling ourselves to be the outsource hub for like all these other big MNCs,
yeah, I mean, we
right?
know we're
So
no
it's
longer a
kinda-
value proposition. We can't possibly try to compete on cost. That's why, for me at least, I always feel that arguments like, oh, our dollar is too strong. Sure, you don't want your dollar to be
Yeah, you always get
excessively
that.
strong. Yeah, no. So you don't want your dollar to be excessively strong. There's some argument to that. But so much of what we do should no longer be trying to compete in terms of crude costs. We need to compete in terms of value add. And value add does, as the name imply, get paid. And so the more we are able to leverage that, the more we're able to distinguish ourselves in terms of the extent to which we can value add, the less we need to compete in terms of something that the rest of the world could get to and possibly outcompete us in, because it's just a lot cheaper there. And this pressure will continue, right? Look at the cost of rental, the cost of land. All this is escalating. And so if we continue to just focus on costs, as important as rationalizing costs is, we are not going to distinguish ourselves.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
We need to distinguish ourselves in terms of what we offer: quality, value add, ideas, innovation, knowledge. All those will ultimately set us apart. That will set Brand Singapore apart. And that will be what drives us into a 21st century economy.
Okay, thank you for spending time with us.
Thanks, Reggie.
Lovely.
My pleasure.
All the best for your new book.
Thank you.
Check out Amazon link. We'll put it below, right? And all the major bookstores. And importantly, follow our newsletter. We've been building this newsletter for a while, and we commit to more interesting things this year. And if you want to stay, in tune with what TFC has to offer, whether it's at our events and all that, just sign up for our newsletter. We'll keep you updated. So yes, put the link below. And with that, that's the end of our episode today. We'll see you next week. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.